So coming back to commons, the definition of terms, what's commons-based peer production, and how is that? Where does that fit in? How is that different to the commons? Why is it different from just peer production?
Um, there's a group of people called the Common Strategies Group. It's just a very small group, and David Bollier is one, and Michelle Bowens at the P2P Foundation is another person, and they've been working on the writing about commons peer production and the commons movement for over a decade now, anyway. And Michelle on his site, the P2P Foundation site, documents lots of articles about different examples of commoning and peer production. So I know WikiHouse. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different open source hardware, people working on decentralized types of production that can develop a decentralized, can enable a decentralized region to be more resilient, more self-reliant, not necessarily relying so much on world trade and global corporations to provide for local citizens. And these commons peer-to-peer solutions are things that he documents, both in relationship to the P2P Foundation website, but also in relationship to a blog they do, which is a very interesting magazine called Commons Transition, which has lots of articles written by advocates for this commons economy. So there's a growing commons movement. If you look to Barcelona, for example, where Ada Colau became the mayor, she was very involved in the Stop the Evictions movement. She led the grassroots movement to stop the evictions of people who had mortgage debt and were being evicted by the banks after the 2008 crisis. And she got elected a few years ago on the Commons Party in Barcelona. She became she holds a kind of a coalition government together, and they've been developing with her as mayor a commons model for Barcelona in relationship to thinking about cooperative energy, thinking about common systems for housing, common systems for other shared resources. So there are a number of cities beginning to think, well, maybe we could go the way that Barcelona is trying to go. In Bologna, for example, in Italy, a lawyer there called Christian Ione developed the Bologna regulations. The Bologna regulations are a new social contract between citizens or common people of Bologna and the state, because the state, because of the crisis, the welfare state is not able to manage libraries, parks, a whole lot of public amenities that, if they're not looked after, will be like we've seen here, that land will be flogged off. We'll lose those common resources will be privatized. So the Bologna regulations enable the state, the local government, that is, in this case, the state, the lowest level, one of the lowest levels of the state is local government, for them to form a social contract with the citizens, and the citizens then agree a deal with the local government in Bologna to manage a park or a square or something like that. So it's a way of developing commons in the city at the neighborhood level and other levels.
So I'm specifically talking about definition. So the commons is going to be a new topic on low impact, and maybe peer production is a new topic as well, and the gift economy is a new topic as well, or do they come under the commons, do you think?
They're very closely related. Peer-to-peer production is trying to use is trying to develop something that actually is about making commons, building commons, co-developing commons.
So it is a very similar. So
well,
yes.
it's the stakeholders. It's the stakeholders who are in the process of commonwealth building, because they're committed to the commons philosophically and practically. That's what they want to do. and in their peer-to-peer production, commons is their goal. You know, they're trying to, like, you know, couch surfing or something like that. They're trying to kind of Wikipedia. You know, Creative Commons licensing.
I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, how they sometimes, rather than copyright, they're talking about, Michelle Bowens is arguing for copy left.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that should maybe be a different topic.
So the property rights are, you're creating commons property rights.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So that's what you're doing. I mean, just for example, you know, like in 1215 there was Magna Carta, but 2 years after that,
the Charter of the Forest.
King John produced, you know, had to agree the Charter of the Forest, which created commons rights that still exist in places for, you know, taking turf, for fishing rights in some cases, but also in terms of wood, access to the forest and things like that. Pasture land, those were commoner rights. So the medieval commons were recognized by the Charter of the Forest. You know, that was peer-to-peer production in the time. So think of that as peer-to-peer production.
Mm-hmm.
For, you know.
So what about things like maker spaces, the maker movement? Is that commons?
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's yeah. I mean, it depends on. I mean, there are a lot of maker spaces. There are a lot of maker spaces that are privately owned and controlled. So, I think if the workspace is being developed by a cooperative, then it seems to me that it should have an asset lock, and it should be kind of owned and controlled by the members. So that's where I think the cooperative ownership and the commons ownership can kind of come together in a creative hybrid.
Fab Labs?
Yeah, the Fab Labs are, you know, I mean, Michelle Bowens has got maker spaces, Fab Labs. He's got different documents on his website, or the P2P Foundation website. Okay. There's thousands of articles about these different manifestations of commons peer production.
Okay. What about MOOCs, massive open online courses?
Well, that's an interesting question, but you know, most of those are run by universities, and they use a proprietary system called Canvas, for example. So yeah, you could have a common MOOC, but then you'd have to work on developing the platform for it.
Okay. I was just thinking of the fact that they're free.
No, it's not just free. I mean, lots of things are free. But, you know, think of Google in that sense. It's the whole shared economy is deceptive in that it's actually about, with Facebook, we've seen with Facebook, you know, the private data and the selling of the private data. You know, yeah. But there are some in Switzerland. Some of the health cooperatives are data co-ops. So there are some examples of data co-ops that would be the opposite of the Silicon Valley, you know, behemoths that we know.
Yeah. I mean, going
whole gig economy sector.
Going back to, sorry, go on.
Whether it's Uber or B&B, Airbnb, you know, who owns and controls the platform?
Yeah, yeah.
And
sharing economy is a complete misnomer, isn't it?
It is a misnomer. It's been corrupted as a term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that's surely, yeah, the ambition is sharing. I mean, that's a good thing. But then it's got to be kind of democratically owned and controlled.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Going back to what you were just saying about intellectual property rights, it occurred to me that you know Ayn Rand and her book Atlas Shrugged, which is a real favorite of the libertarian right. Do you know the story?
I've not read the book.
You haven't read the book. It's,
I know about Ayn Rand though. Yeah.
Yeah. So her hero in that book was an industrialist, and he came up with a machine that would produce endless clean energy for the world. And so the government wanted the patent, wanted to take it over, and and he said, no, I don't trust the government. I want to keep control of this machine because I trust myself and the people I work with. And they went off into the desert and they started a new community and away from the government in a completely libertarian community. But of course, if they didn't have intellectual property rights, which are enforced by the government, then people are going to reverse engineer his machine, and they're going to just not steal the patent. They get patent. They're going to use it. They're just going to use that machine. It seemed to be a contradiction. He didn't want the government at all, and yet he still did want intellectual property rights. So it was inconsistent. The whole story was inconsistent for me.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, he wants the courts to enforce those property rights.
Exactly.
He wants the police.
Yes.
to
Arrest people,
capture the thieves and put them in jail and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So intellectual.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering what your position is with intellectual property rights at all. Should they exist?
Well, I don't know. I think that's I think it's an interesting question. I mean, in the sense of how can musicians earn a living, and people who create things. So I think patents and those sorts of things. It's what I was saying before. I mean, how do you kind of deal with recognizing that people need to make a livelihood, people need a place to live. It's a question of how do you limit those property rights so that they don't become extractive. So I think it's like the I and the we. I think, how do we find a system of dynamic property rights that recognize individuals' personal need for some sort of autonomy, agency, and that would also apply to small groups, and those to be protected, but only up to the limits where they're sufficient for meeting the needs of those people. Beyond that, when there's surplus property, it's a surplus property that, organizations like Uber, for example, want to create a complete monopoly, where you think of, there's Lyft as well, but there aren't that many companies that are in that space because they've got their whole shed ton of money behind them, is actually trying to create a monopoly where there's no other provider. So yeah, I think the issue of property rights is that I think a certain amount of property rights. For example, you look at the community land trust. The community land trust says, okay, you can't own the land, but you can own your own home, or you can set up a housing co-op to lease from the land trust. So it recognizes that people owning their own home, looking after it, painting it, repairing it, that kind of thing for their own personal property. That's okay. They have enough for themselves and their family. Owning 2 or 3 houses, well, then you're into the landlord game, So it's, how do you actually create the right balance between sufficient private property, which is non-extractive, and commonwealth that is beyond that, or for that matter, state ownership of certain resources that could be managed like a commons. Yeah. So, for example, the National Health Service could not have come into existence after the Second World War if for the previous century before that, trade unionists had not developed with others 23,000 friendly societies that were providing health care.
You mentioned this before. I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
So the whole foundation of the NHS couldn't have happened without the struggle of working people to actually provide health services, and hire their own doctors and things like that, because they couldn't afford, the prices in the open market. So right. They had a mutual aid solution.
Could you just say something about the benefits of the commons?
Well, the benefits of the commons are, you know, what we take for granted. When we actually had, I mean, there's so many things that we're losing. That grew out of common struggles to create something that was a universal good. Like, for example, education was non-private until recently. Now the private markets crept in everywhere, higher education, lower education. We're losing the health service by a series of privatization moves that are happening, just organically evolving and happening. Look at the situation with public services. Look at Carillion. Look at the state of the social care system. So there is an important, I think, contract, and this is where the Bologna regulations to me are interesting, that we can develop a contract between citizens and the state in basically a public cooperative partnership. That would be quite interesting. Where we're trying, it could have been some said tonight, well, why do we have to tell these friendly societies, we don't need you anymore? Why couldn't the cooperatives and the state work out a social contract to co-manage the health service in a distributed way?
Yeah.
Now, I think that would actually help us decentralize, distribute, and democratize.
Yeah.
But actually not realize that we need a safety net which the state can provide. And so that's a different argument, isn't it?
Mm.
It's not a public-private partnership. We know where the libertarian right has been going with that one for the last 30 plus years. But actually, where is the economic democracy alternative on the left? It's not articulated well enough. But I think commons thinking, co-op thinking more deeply, rethinking the welfare state and how we can actually find an alliance between trade unions, co-ops, local government, the public. It would be a new form of economic democracy, a new form of much more deeply democratic socialism.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I mean, I had a conversation with 4 ex-city traders recently, and they're libertarian right, and I said to them, you don't want to be told what to do by government bureaucrats or the state, and they said no. I said, well, why don't you take it a step further? Why are you happy to be told what to do by capitalist bosses? Why is that okay? But being told what to do by state bureaucrats is not okay. Why don't you take it a step further and say, I don't want to be told what to do by anybody. Why don't you have economic democracy and decentralization, as well as, freedom from the state? Why not freedom from capitalist bosses? And they sort of agreed, and they said, ooh, you're straying close to anarchism there. It's like, well, you can use the word if you like, but let's just talk about a cooperative, non-extractive economy. What's wrong with that? And they were quite open to the idea.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's something that, well, I've said this before, I don't think it's something that necessarily will scare the right. I mean, as soon as you use the word socialism, you will scare the right. But if you talk about freedom from, being told what to do by state power or corporate power, which in this day and age is very, very closely knit together, then, we can actually bring a lot of people on board with the idea that traditionally have not been on board with the idea. But I think that we can. I don't think there's much there to scare them.
Mm. Well, I don't know. It depends on, I mean, there is a narrative to be forged, and that's our problem. We need a common narrative that brings people to support an alternative, a plan C, a commons plan, if you like, or a commons cooperative plan.
Yeah, we're all in this together.
C squared or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's missing, I think, because I think the co-op movement seems to rediscover cooperative commonwealth when times get really hard. So, for
Yeah.
example, in the 1890s, there was a lot of discussion of cooperative commonwealth. You looked at the trade union banners then, around 1900, all had, you know, cooperative commonwealth on it. You know, they all had this kind of vision. William Morris talked about these kind of ideas. That was rich until about, you know, the late 1920s. It was quite a rich kind of vision. Then it disappears with, you know, the welfare state and this, you know, the state market alliance post World War II. But then in the 60s and the 70s, the common ownership movement for worker co-ops all over the world, Italy, Spain, USA, Canada. So when I was talking to you about the you know, the support by Tony Benn for the, you know, economic democracy and industrial common ownership, that spread all over the place. And there was then, until the miners' strike, there was a lot of interest in cooperative commonwealth. You know, there were a lot of discussions about it, but then people forgot about it. And then now it's being picked up again. So it kind of comes round again. But if the early co-op founders, the pioneers like William Thompson, for example, were saying, how do we actually take land, people, and money out of the market? Those are three cardinal questions to actually establish economic democracy on solid foundations. And we only think about the co-op business in isolation and ignore the money question, ignore the land question, in order the commons question. No wonder the kind of co-op movement is firing on one cylinder, because it actually it's forgot its history. It's forgot the fact that we've been here before.
How do we knit these things together? I mean, for example, you've got organisations like the Ecological Land Co-op who are addressing the land problem, and although they're small, their idea is brilliant. And I mean, I know there's the Scottish Farmlands Trust, which is starting in Scotland now, which is doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So they have the right idea, and then there are people working in mutual credit, which I think is the best attempt to democratize money, the exchange system. And you know, and there's the cooperative movement, and I like to involve you know, sole traders in this as well. They are one-person democratic institutions, and so that's where the real growth in jobs is nowadays, isn't it? It's in the small business sector and the sole trader sector, and that includes co-ops. And so how do we knit all this together to create a movement?
Well, that's, I mean, there are people working on that. I mean, that's what the New Economic Coalition in the United States is pursuing. The Democracy Collaborative of the States is doing a lot of work on policy for building commonwealth, building community commonwealth is sometimes talk about. We don't have anything quite like that here yet, although there are strands actually converging. So the control shift is a step in that direction. Open democracy has got a dialogue going on about you know, what would a good future for the UK look like, and there's a lot of interesting articles that they post on. Well, you know, this would be a new approach to democratic energy. This would be a new approach to housing. You know, so there's lots of elements in the UK happening that are at the moment fragmented. And they do need to find common ground. So I think both the solidarity economy ideas and the commons work that people like David Bollier and the Common Strategies Group are advancing, those can help us kind of create glue to build an alliance of fellow travelers who are basically walking the talk, but at the moment they're doing it in isolation, and they haven't actually, there's no horizontal kind of connectivity to these different change agents who are building a new economy. But you know, setting up community land trusts, or setting up worker co-ops, or setting up ecological land co-ops, those are also challenging in their own right, that actually you don't have time to think about much else. But you should do. I think cooperative commons education is a key thing. The whole movement to create the welfare state was actually advanced through the Worker Education Association, advancing, you know, FE, basically further education courses as lifelong learning. They were, trade unions and co-ops, local authorities were supporting the Worker Education Association to advance new economy solutions. So and there is actually some work going on. The Cooperative College has been working on the idea of a cooperative university with a number of worker education and smaller colleges who are being threatened by the kind of the high fees in the universities to create a kind of distributed cooperative university. So there is work going on that.
I know there's fantastic work going on. I mean, I talk to people who are working in this new economy all the time. There's fantastic work going on. I suppose I'm looking for the catalyst to knit them all together to build a more effective movement that can take market share. I thought that mutual credit might be key. I thought that might be a key component.
Yeah,
and I still do, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's it is a very important part of the jigsaw. You're absolutely right. I think also, but I don't think it's sufficient in the sense that it tries to provide liquidity for businesses in an interest-free way, and that's really a key missing link. But it doesn't necessarily provide all the kind of financial services that one needs to build a kind of a democratic finance system. And I think that we need to find a way of connecting, for example, the work on credit unions, community development finance, mutual credit, these new public banks that people are working on, regional co-op banks that are being worked on. We need to find a way of actually bringing them together because they're all part of the answer, but brought together, actually, they could provide a much more powerful set of tools than just mutual credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be interested in talking more about that at some point. So people who are listening to this, or they read about the commons and they start to understand the commons, what can they do if they want to sort of join in and help build the commons and get involved? What can they do?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a commons movement in this country. Okay, in other countries, for example, in Greece, as I said, in Catalonia, there is an emergence of a commons movement, and it's quite closely allied in many countries with the solidarity economy movement. So, for example, in the Greek crisis, a few years back, they would have commons festivals every year. They started in Crete, a couple in Crete. Then I went to the one in Athens, which is a big festival that brought people together to play music together, to listen to talks together, to actually have a kind of a teach-in, and to share food and whatever. And that still happens in Greece. So they've established a kind of a grassroots movement for the solidarity economy and the commons. And you see that also like in Portugal emerging as well. So in Southern European countries where, the unemployment of people has been a lot higher than here, with youth unemployment of 50%, post 2008, and a lot of those Mediterranean countries, that kind of jobs crisis, that breakdown of the system, drove a lot of people to kind of come together in a way that in this country we haven't actually established that kind of solidarity yet. So there's still the sharp elbows quite a bit.
When you said when you say in Greece there's a commons movement and a solidarity economy movement, what exactly is the difference between the commons movement and the solidarity economy movement?
Yeah, well, they do overlap. They do overlap. They're part of a new economy mentality, and that's fine. I mean, that's fine. So solidarity economy is developing social cooperatives, for example, for care, for green energy, and the commons movement is working on maker spaces and peer-to-peer production and copy left ideas. I mean, they can come together, the free software, they can come together and have conversations and compare notes and kind of learn from each other. That's fine.
I still like the name of the new economy. And people say, and if people say, what's new about it? Say it's democratic and non-extractive, and that's it. It's really simple. And there are so many ways that it can be democratic and non-extractive. It seems to be a good umbrella term, and people understand. It's a new economy.
Well, I've been involved with New Economics Foundation. I'm a fellow there since it was really set up in the late 80s, and I've always been perplexed about the new economy. I mean, because it doesn't tell me anything. And when in fact, new economy was used by Tony Blair to promote the third way.
Yeah.
So it's not neutral at all. It's quite loaded.
Yeah. What about non-extractive economy?
That's why I prefer, reclaiming the cooperative commonwealth tradition, promoting that, because it's coming round again, and co-ops that don't kind of dig deeper into their history and their tradition and how things, why is it the co-op movement is now only 2% of GDP when, in Italy it's 10% of GDP. It's much bigger in Italy.
Yeah.
Why is it that we've got 500 worker co-ops in Italy? There's 23,000 worker co-ops and multi-stakeholder social co-ops. Employ almost 1 million jobs in those co-ops in Italy. Because they developed the solidarity economy in Italy since the late 1970s. They put in place the laws for worker co-ops, for social co-ops. They put in place the financing system. They put in place the education. They've done a lot more to make the economic democracy movement much more evident in not all of Italy, but certainly, in many parts of Italy, it's quite clear that the co-ops have got a very big share of what's happening locally in the region.
Yeah, you said economic democracy. Maybe that's the democratic economy. Maybe that's an obvious label. But you said the co-op movement sort of comes and goes, and you think it's coming back at the moment. Then what's to stop it going again? How can we keep it growing so it really sort of basically takes over?
Well, I think certainly that's what's being pursued, and which I find interesting about the U.S. work, is that there's the New Economics Coalition has been focusing quite a lot on how to develop economic democracy solutions. So, for example, to take back the electricity grid from private ownership and to bring it into at least public ownership again, if not some sort of commons ownership. To set up in cities like New York and there's like 10 cities where local authorities are looking at how they can actually support the development of worker co-ops, and in some other places multi-stakeholder co-ops. So public social partnerships are emerging in different cities. New York City is a good example, where the Mayor Blasio is under pressure from an organized new cooperative economics alliance in New York City, has set up a worker co-op development fund, and has put in several $1 million into that fund to help worker cooperatives develop. So, early days, but it's good beginnings. We've been here before. I mean, this isn't, this did happen in the 70s and the 80s in this country, but we've forgotten about that. We need to put together an ecosystem of support. We need public policy to support these economic democracy solutions. So Preston, for example, is interesting in the way that the leader there, Matthew Brown, is trying to promote the local economy through procurement, and through support for things that could be made locally and provided locally. So actually,
it's really worked, hasn't it? It's done a fantastic job.
It's making a difference, and now looking much more into advancing cooperatives that actually are involved with the trade union co-op ideas are being being considered now in Preston, ways to kind of advance that. So, but we need more local authorities to kind of be looking at what Preston's doing and pursuing similar economic democracy solutions.
Mm-hmm.
We can't ignore the state. We can't ignore politicians. We do need to get policy and political buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so important.